Beautiful. All right. Well, good afternoon, folks. Did you want to do a little intro there, Melissa? I mean, excuse me, Malia. I got you mixed up.
That's the other one.
Right.
Yeah. So this is Malia Hughes, Kitsap County Parent Coalition. Welcome to Kitsap County's Autism Workshops with Monica Meyer. Today we're talking about autism and IEP goals. Take it away.
Thank
After
you.
you have that drink.
After I just get down a drink so I don't clear my throat through the whole thing.
Oh, I did forget to say, if for those of us who are here, could you please put your name and your email in the chat?
That way we'll know if you're a teacher, that make sure that you're on the enrollment so that you are given credit for the for your attendance and for clock hours. And
I need it for the county to show the county that we had people coming.
Perfect. It's a twofer.
Right.
All right. So I'm as Malia had said, and it's funny, I'll just kind of side note, my granddaughter's name is Malia, and that's the only other person I've known, obviously, other than Barack Obama's daughter, Malia, but it's spelled differently. But Malia and my Malia both spell their name the same, which is kind of like, it's weird to see it and go, oh, it's not my granddaughter, it's you. So anyway, just a little side note. Anyway, my name is Monica Meyer. I have been providing training and technical assistance in the field of autism for, I don't want to say how many years, but I do have an adult son with autism. And prior to, not prior to, but in kind of in this journey of supporting my son with autism, have done work and developed a regional autism consulting cadre through ESD 112 that I did for 12 years, and really brought in best practices into Southwest Washington and created opportunities for teaching and other sorts of supports, not only for children, but for adults, and which was kind of the impetus for starting my own business. And have kind of grown with, I have grown with my son as he has grown, as he aged out of the school system. I started working in the adult system. And so that's where I am currently, although I work across the lifespan of people with autism. And I do bring a lot of my life experience into this training. And so I will be sharing some of those stories. And if you have questions, or you can certainly raise your hand. Malia is going to be the one that's going to be monitoring and managing that. And if you don't want to be on camera, you can certainly ask questions in the chat box, and Malia will stop me and say, oh, by the way, you need to do this. All right, so really to start off with, well, first, I mean, there's several things that I'm going to be talking about today. And, as I was in the shower earlier today, I thought, oh, you know what, I forgot to put my agenda, what I'm going to put in there. And of course, I promptly forgot. So I am going to be talking about, obviously IEP goals and objectives, talking about person-centered planning, and talking about barriers or characteristics of autism and implications of supports. And as always, for those who've gone to my trainings before, I try and cram a lot of information into a very short period of time. So I apologize for that, but in one regard, and then in the other regard, I also did not put in a lot of examples, although I will be talking about examples, and that's because we are in a limited time where I just want to give you as much information as we possibly can. So identifying and acknowledging long-term outcomes. The ultimate success of our children in school have been, how do we prepare this person for life after school? It's, I mean, that is the duty of the school system, is that they have provided all people, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, a free and appropriate public education. And so looking at why is that important? Well, it's because this is a process to help prepare a person for life after school. You know, years ago, it used to be No Child Left Behind. And now, oh, that the name has just escaped me, is Every Student Succeeds Act. I think it's ESSA. And so it is just another iteration of what the No Child Left Behind was. And it is, how do we make sure that we are capturing and getting information that's going to help a person succeed throughout their school, and to carry those strategies and supports into adult life. So identify and acknowledge long-term outcomes is, regardless of the person, the child, this process should begin as early as possible. We know that early intervention services have literally provided opportunities for students that even 20 years ago, there were fewer children who had who could speak verbally, that with early intervention services had a 50% increase. And so this early intervention is very important. I'm not saying that if you miss, it's not like, oh, that's that window of opportunity. If I missed it, we've missed the boat. That's not true. And I can tell you, just as being a parent of an adult with autism, I can tell you that each person is a lifelong learner. And although my son did go through early intervention services many years ago, that has certainly changed. And the resources are different, but just to let you know that early intervention services is a very good kickstart to an educational career. One of the other things I want to acknowledge is what person-centered planning is. And if you've gone through person-centered planning or know what person-centered plan is, it really is it's a tool, but it's also a process to help families and a team look at the long-term vision. Because as we as parents go into an IEP meeting, our vision of what could or should be could be very different from what the teachers are and what everybody else in that room. So the idea that everybody coming into that room with your son or daughter's potential and possibilities are all the same is really, we're not doing that student any favors, because we all need to be on the same page. And a person-centered plan allows for, and I actually did training years ago and it was how to make your IEP legally defensible. And that is through the person-centered plan process, because everybody that attends at that, and usually it is the multidisciplinary or the care team or the assessment team, comes together and we do a person-centered plan, and all information is shared at the same time. And nothing is off the table. Everything is put out there. So you get an understanding of where people are, where their priorities are. So for mom or dad who just want to make sure that, their son or daughter is able to be able to sit at the dining room table and eat his food without disrupting the family, that's an immediate need. In the long term, it's going to, would be, hopefully my son or daughter will be able to go out to a restaurant, will be able to, be part of his community. So it's looking at not only the macro, but the micro opportunities, and that this is a long-term outcome. And it's looking at where we are ahead and then looking back and taking those steps, going all the way back and starting from the beginning. How do we get there is ultimately what we want to do for our students. And we know while the vision may shift and change as a child matures, and many of our children do, obviously we can always change plans. we can always revisit. And I can tell you, as children mature and they start gaining skills, the IEP will look different. I can also tell you that with children, and not to, impart fear in anyone, but during it, it is something that is, as a neurotypical child would experience, is the same as a child with autism, that the teenage years are difficult. They're just difficult. We've got hormones that are playing in. We've got a lot of things going on. So we have to oftentimes separate what is just as a neurotypical child would experience and what is something that is related to an autism spectrum disorder. And sometimes people, unfortunately, will scrutinize people who have a disability more intently than they would a person who is neurotypical. And we want to bring back, just the knowledge that, gosh, all kids in middle school can be resistant to change, are sometimes very, can be isolating, that they don't want to speak out. There are a lot of things that they're trying to express themselves. I mean, just like you were saying, that your daughter was a little hesitant to use a strategy because, she's a young adult. It's like saying, Malia, we're going to start this, this project with you. And I know what I would do is I would hesitate and say, wait a minute, what's this about? And so her response of like, I don't want to do that is a very typical, teenage response. So in some states, person-centered plans are embedded in the IEP process, which is great. And matter of fact, I think it was 2017, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare, or Medicare and Medicaid, passed a law that stated that any federally funded entity, such as a school district, needs to put person-centered planning as part of the process for services. And so you will see, especially if folks who are associated with developmental disabilities, they have an annual assessment, the individual, what they refer to now as a person-centered service plan. And it's person-centered. It looks at what are the strengths and interests of the individual, what are some of the barriers, and how do we really incorporate this and make this into a plan that's going to be person-centered. I mean, go figure. And then what we want to make sure is that we're making goals that are meaningful and important to the individual, important to the team, and that we come to a consensus about it. We have oftentimes this team has, not only the general ed teacher, special ed teacher, you have maybe a speech and language pathologist, occupational therapist, some have a physical therapist, and sometimes there's technology involved. And so for everyone to have something that's going to be completely different, we need to be able to come together and say, how did this all work together? And then the other piece that schools have to do is look at, how do we tie this to the state standards? So at the same time, it's important to develop the goals and objectives that are both immediate and important, but we need to remember and recognize the future of what we're looking for and where we are now, so that we can say, look where we were, and this is where we're going, and this is how we did it. So because the amount of time required for some students, it's critical that this time is used in a manner that really is the greatest benefit for the student. When you think about, I tell families that this time while they're in school is the only entitlement that they will receive in their entire life. And we want to make sure that those benefits are something that person is going to receive. Because otherwise what happens is if we don't tie it to long-term plans, and if we just kind of go with the flow, oftentimes we miss out on opportunities. And this is the most important potential, and as a neurotypical child would, is
this is the important piece, is the free and appropriate education that everyone receives, but it is also as critical that we make sure we get it right for our students who experience autism or an intellectual disability or developmental disabilities. And with that, so let's look at, it may be more critical for a student, to be taught a skill like the next dollar up strategy, rather than saying, we want to have the student learn how to put pegs into a box. Of course, there are some things with hand dexterity that would be important, but how do we make it functional? And I'm a strong advocate of functional academics. Is how do we help a person? And it's not counting out 100 pennies to get the concept of what a dollar is. What we want to do is help the person understand that there is a connection between paying, the exchange of money for an object. It's, do we want the person to know that this dollar is worth 100 pennies, or do we want the person to understand that there is a context of using money as an exchange for goods or services? So again, it's just looking at the perspective of what that means. And if they're in middle school and we're still working on the same goal, we are missing the boat, and we need to regroup and find out what's going to be important and how do we move this forward. So short-term objectives should be observable and measurable. And I'll get into the measurable piece here in just a moment, because that's part of the one of the scenarios where having it measured is very important. And I will refer to a friend of mine that I worked with for many years, and he has since passed away because of not COVID, because of cancer. But basically, it is, data will set you free. Being able to figure out what it is that the individual needs, and how can we help this person become more of an effective, efficient learner. And that's going to be, oftentimes, it's not only measuring how the person is really progressing on their goals, but secondly, and I would say for me, in many cases, it's oftentimes a barrier to skill development is the consistency of supports, the consistency of instruction. And so that's also something to be measured, is how do we ensure that this student who needs structure and predictability is, let's say, transitioning from a life skills classroom and is going into a general education classroom, that oftentimes they are supported by a paraprofessional or paraeducator that maybe does not have the necessary tools, such as how do I help this person be included and involved, rather than just having access and doing something separate. So there's a multitude of things that happen with an IEP, and taking data is going to be one of those pieces that really is, like I said, it's helps us be able to measure a person's progress, and then also helps us measure, is the instruction that is being provided to this goal measurable? Is it being consistent? Because as I get to the part where we talk about the characteristics of autism and the implications of support, consistency is a huge, huge component to a person's instructional needs. So in other words, multiple professionals and family members should be able to reach consensus regarding whether the student has or has not reached a goal. And, years ago, going as being actually an advocate for schools many years ago, and I shouldn't say many years ago, because as recently as even last week, working with a student in a school district in the Puget Sound area, that they are still struggling. And this young man is 17 years old, and he doesn't have a functional way to communicate. And she's obviously, mom is worried, how are we, how is he going to communicate when he exits school? And, some people say, well, that ship has sailed. And I would say, no, it hasn't. I have helped literally people who have never had a functional communication system, and they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, gain skills to be able to communicate their wants or needs. Oops, sorry about that. So the objectives should be, context specific. Different contexts require different behaviors. So for example, the type of social skills and behaviors allowed at recess for a child would not be the same for those allowed in the classroom. And again, this is where one of those times where sometimes our kids are held to a higher standard of behaviors, because, if they're playing tag or if they're out, and, the difference of being able to generalize a skill from one place to another can be highly scrutinized. And that is one of those teachable opportunities, is to have that student understand that this isn't recess time. And so these are the social rules that we follow because we're in the classroom, and helping the student know, rather than, which oftentimes happens, unfortunately, is chastising a child because they participated in a negative, in a behavior that maybe the paraeducator or the teacher felt as being unsavory or, not socially appropriate. There are teachable moments throughout our student's life. And with that being said, we also need to look at how do we help this person understand not only the context of which it occurs, but the concept of what does it mean, the difference between being outside behavior and being inside behavior is the same as an adult who's at home and can, tell a joke to his brothers and sisters, and they think it's funny, and then going to work and telling a joke that nobody laughs, and some might even feel is inappropriate. So the components are very important, and not only the context, but the concept that we want to be teaching to. And this is, for example, playing tag with two classmates is appropriate. That's what you do, but probably not the same that you would do in the middle school science class. And because kids on the spectrum often have difficulty shifting their behaviors to suit the context, I wouldn't say just children, obviously, it's anybody on the autism spectrum. Sometimes it becomes important to clarify expectations by relating objectives to specific content, texts, and I would say content, context, and conception. Criteria must be written in a manner that is possible to measure. And again, my homage to my friend, Dr. Tony Dunn, who was a school psychologist in the at ESD 112 in our region, in my region in Southwest Washington. He was one of the school psychologists on the autism regional autism consulting cadre that I coordinated. And interesting, when he first started, he was, a very dyed-in-the-wool school psychology mindset of consequences to behaviors that need to be more have a negative impact, so the student wouldn't do it again. More behavior modification versus him understanding what a positive behavior support plan, and I would say the evolution in this of his thinking was something that was very profound. And for me, just really delighted in the conversations that we had, and he learned a lot and I learned a lot from him, especially when it comes to data. So the IEP document provides us guidance into what we want the student to learn. One area that many teachers focus on is really the behavior of a student with autism, because sometimes it can be disruptive. And then while family members and staff may be focused on really eliminating or decreasing the behavior, really the desired outcome is provide the student with an alternative way to get their needs met. So the objectives such as the following, do not tell students what they are to do. I mean, for instance, Maggie will quit hitting, Jeff will quit throwing. I mean, that's the duh, excuse me. But what we want to do is provide him or her with an alternative way to get their needs met. And what we need to remember is that we have, when we look at the dyad of impairment for a student with autism, the dyad includes a social communication, which is an everyday part of a person's experience at school is social communication. And that's the major component to this person's disability. And then secondly is the restricted repertoire of behaviors. So, and with that, as I get into some of the characteristics of autism and how they manifest and what they look like and what the implications of support, it will actually kind of pull this all together as well. So what we need to do is, if you take away a behavior and we don't replace it with an alternative, what will happen is most likely is the student will exhibit an even more challenging behavior to get their needs met. So if you've got, Timmy who's throwing something, to be able to say, stop throwing, put it down, stop throwing. Rather, do you need my attention? Let's, or give him an alternative way to find out, really becomes an assessment of what is the function of this behavior. It helps us identify what we can do to help the person. And that's, just basically through a functional behavior assessment, we figure out and gather information through that data that I was talking about, that we can identify what's going on. Because, oftentimes as a matter of fact, here, a situation that I'm working with right now that, the classroom is saying, it's his behavior is coming completely out of the blue. Well, I can tell you most often behaviors do not come out of the blue, and that sometimes there's a trigger, sometimes it's cumulative effect, and sometimes it is just person specific. So there's a plethora of understanding, and it's our role as instructors is to figure out what is the function of this behavior. And when we truly understand what is the function of the behavior, what we're going to be able to do is to find out what are the alternatives that we want to teach. We want to make sure that we have consistent expectations of not only the student, but of the staff and the teacher and the paraeducator that are instructing the student. By better understanding the expectations through a consistency, again, that consistency and that structure and predictability, the student will have a greater chance of being successful. Let's state, for example, Maggie, who has really no functional means to communicate. The alternative skill is Maggie will use her communication card to signal her frustration, 3 out of 4 situations. What we're doing is not extinguishing this behavior. We're recognizing this behavior has a function, and we want to provide her with a skill to get her needs met in a more effective, efficient way. If it's determined that Jeff throws items because he doesn't have any coping skills, which again is one of those social communication, that dyad of impairment, that first pillar is that a person's ability to socialize, to be able to shift their mindset and perspective from one person to another. It can be a very exhausting thing for our kids on the spectrum. And that we then need to focus on teaching this person self-management and self-regulation. And sometimes, sensory regulation or social emotional regulation. That we're looking at that Jeff throws things. He's a younger child. So the alternative skill would be when anxious, Jeff will utilize his self-management strategy 4 out of 5 situations. And the self-management strategy will be, again, one of those adaptive tools that's going to be on the IEP, and we'll get to that here in just a few moments. So state the alternative skill you want the student to learn. You know, these are a few specific ideas that really can lead you into that mindset. So remember that goals and objectives reflect areas of need for the student. It's better to have fewer goals that can be really intensely addressed rather than having 30 of them that are briefly covered without rigorous instruction and attention that each goal needs. It doesn't mean that goals and other skills aren't being worked on at the same time. It just means that these are the priorities that we want to make sure are on the IEP. And what we want to do is make sure that the goals and objectives should not be unattainable, but it should be able to challenge the student, just push them to the edge a bit. That we want to make sure. And we need to also have a mindset that we need to presume competence. Just because a person is performing at a certain level doesn't mean at a certain time, a certain subject, a certain piece of technology, that they won't just catapult into a different atmosphere of knowledge. And so we want to make sure that we're presuming competence when we're writing goals and objectives. In other words, by writing goals and objectives in a manner so that success is obtainable, but we're also keeping it challenging. And that we know that because of self-esteem issues, experience of many students, continual failure may thwart future learning efforts. So the student needs to know that they're making progress. If you have a student that is participating in their IEP as they should be, that they understand that there is data. Look where we've been, look where you are now. And that's important for our students. And part of that has to do with a person's executive function, to be able to see, oh, this is where I was and this is where I am. This is no different for you or I if we start journaling. I want to go walking every day. And I started out with a half mile and I'm up to 3 miles. That journaling, that it becomes more motivating to see that, look where I've gone and this is where I'm at and how much further can I go. That's where having data is something that's going to be very imperative for our students and for our teachers and paraeducators to say, well, by golly, we have been doing great work. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, is the IEP will not cover everything the student is working on, but has really priorities that we focus and that require our intense focus and instruction. And then during the course of the day, professionals will cover many topics and skills not identified on the IEP. And that because students are assessed every 3 years for an IEP. And in the meantime, there are what it's referred to as present levels of academic achievement or present levels of performance that shows that this is where the student is. This is what they're able to do in this classroom or in that setting with this task. And a lot of that, especially, it's interesting because as students exit school, I really coach job developers or job coaches to read the present levels of performance, because they tend to be rich in narrative, rich in information. Assessments are great, but it's very clinical and it doesn't really give a human perspective that I really prefer over what a present level performance does. The IEP should be a living document and not simply visited once a year. And unfortunately, that's a lot of people get into that role. And what we should do is just as simple as any other neurotypical child, is that we meet with the teacher at every term or every quarter, which however way your school works their school year. And we check in, where is progress being made? How else do we need, what else do we need to do? How might we modify some of these objectives to these goals that we've written? Because again, going back to, this is the only entitlement they're going to have in these educational years are very important and valuable, and that we need to pay attention to them. And so what would happen if we go for a whole year, the documentation that shows that maybe goals aren't being achieved and that no progress has been made, we've had a year that's gone by. So how do we make sure? Well, that is by checking in with the teacher, finding out where that, looking for the goals. And, you know, there's and again, without getting into a whole lot of the details, but teachers do develop rubrics, and rubrics are a way of, you know, identifying where the student's at, what are some of the ways that the person is making progress, how do we ensure that the person is making progress, and that they can share that information and data. And that should be something that is also provided for and through a paraeducator if the student has one of those supports with them as well. So the focus on the IEP should be on outcomes and not on process to achieve those outcomes. You know, that being said, there is a high standard for teachers that need to be highly trained in the areas of autism, any other learner or learner needs. And so in there should be, and make sure that you have the adaptations and modifications that need to be part of the IEP document. One of those things that I did, and I still do actually for my son, who as he's exited and he's in the adult service system, there's still goals and objectives. And I want to make sure that through that he is, although he's verbal, he's functionally nonverbal, that people use visual information to communicate with him. They can, and he does follow communication, but he also has a partial complex seizure, intractable seizure disorder. So he has multiple seizures during the day. His capacity of one day to be able to talk and follow directions, it can be sorely compromised the next day, or even the next minute, for heaven's sakes. So to make sure that there's consistency. Sorry, I have a dog who's a little excited. Just a moment.
I love these Zoom moments. While we're waiting for her to come back, for those who have just joined us, please put your name and your email in the chat, and you will get the an after class email with the resources that we talked about, including the presentation and the link to the video. Does anyone have any questions while we wait? Let's see.
Oh boy, I'm back. Sorry about that. Oh, and she might be back again. Ava, go. I think she's the I have a standard schnauzer who thinks she is the queen of the world and nobody should be walking by our house. So
We didn't even hear her.
oh really? Oh geez. All right. Okay, so back to instruction. As I said, we need to, I mean, teachers have gone through a rigorous training and education, and actually with No Child Left Behind, and then the next iteration of Every Student Should Succeed Act, is that teachers need to have a master's higher level of instruction and knowledge. But that being said, the consistency of instruction is very important. And that many different ways to teach a student, there are specific skills. And we want to make sure those specific skills are addressed and that there is a consistent way of approaching that. The outcome of an IEP is not that a student will receive a specific program, and that should never be the implication. Matter of fact, placement or a program should not be a even a consideration until we finish the IEP. If I would say if teachers or the school is saying, talking about placement before we've even discussed an IEP or what the goals should be or where the educational instruction should be, they're not following what the rules and the regulations of what IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, has outlined. Though teachers need to be prepared and knowledgeable of best practice to support best practice supports and strategies, sometimes we do need to be even more specific and make sure that we have the teaching and training. And, you know, that's, again, that was really the genesis for the Regional Autism Consulting Cadre when I started it some years ago, was that best practices had not been identified. Matter of fact, even looking at the idea of, you know, applied behavior analysis was like, oh, that's just, you know, we can't do that. I mean, that's not something that we do. And now we have, you know, board certified behavior analysts that are in school districts that are able to help and support, and that we've got insurance companies that are paying for applied behavior analysis. Also, applied behavior analysis has advanced so much further than what was first developed through discrete trial training of Dr. Ivan Lovas at UCLA, you know, 100,000 years ago. Okay, it wasn't that long ago, but I mean, it was a while ago. But at any rate, applied behavior analysis and how basically applied behavior analysis is not a theory, it's not a practice, it's a process of applying an instruction, recording the behavior, and what is the outcome. So that's what applied behavior analysis, a discrete trial training or pivotal response or picture exchange. Those are all actions of which we can apply the method of applied behavior analysis to. Oops, here we go. Oh, heavens, I just jumped ahead too far. IEP does not dictate placement. And I think I mentioned that before. And this is really important. And for those of you who are familiar, or maybe who are not familiar with, is really our school districts, hopefully will start to evolve even more, are taking under the understanding and consideration of universal design for learning. That the one of the outcomes, the most important outcome for our students is obviously academic achievement, because that's why they're in school, but also being part of their community and providing input and being active in their community. And their community starts with their original family. And the second most important part of their community life is school. And I can tell you what happens when you remove students with disabilities from neurotypical children. The message that we're sending is not one that we want to continue. What it's saying is, you're not good enough, you're not able enough, you're not part of us, that you are separate, to the point that a lot of teachers, a lot of administrators have the same mindset. Well, it's those students that are causing problems. It's those students, rather than we have an obligation to meet the learning needs of all of our students. And the positive reality of universal design for learning is that we are looking at ways to incorporate, how do we make our learning community, of which our schools are, a more welcoming place, rather than saying, you know, well, we have most kids go with, quote, this diagnosis, I'll go to life skills classrooms. What is it in life skills classroom that they can't do in the general education or general population? I mean, those are some of the things that we want to stop and ask ourselves and be able to be help people understand that. Support and advocacy. Here's another is for parents with IEP. Really, this process can be overwhelming. You know, it's important to send a copy of the IEP document in advance of the meeting. You know, I would say prior to that, that we've done a person-centered plan, that we've looked at what are the attributes in the, you know, who is this person? What are their strengths and interests? What are some of the barriers to a person achieving, you know, community success? Those are ways that we can start identifying how we write the IEP. And prior to that, the teacher will put things together and give it to the family and say, have a look at this. And then we can certainly go from there. It's a place to start. Research has shown that when schools have given families the copy of the IEP prior to the meeting, the process really goes smoother. And then parents also report that they feel less pressure and defensive when they are given the opportunity to preview the IEP. They're even less pressured or defensive when they are a part of the process, such as having a person-centered plan, that we are all providing input on an equal basis, rather than, you know, the teachers or the school psychologists and everybody doing things in isolation. Because I don't know about you, but my kid isn't all chopped up into different pieces. He acts as one thing, as one individual, as one human being. And so should the team that is supporting and providing instruction. Another homage to my friend Tony Dunn is, however, for each objective, data collection must be developed both for the purposes of accountability and for making ongoing instructional decisions. And so this doesn't mean that we're taking data. Well, it could be that we're taking data on behavior. It could be, why does this person use a non-functional form of communication, and how can we help this person achieve a more effective, efficient way of communicating? Yes, that is one thing. But as you notice here, it's the data collection is both for the purpose of accountability, that we are doing what we said we would do on the IEP. It's also saying that, how is this person making progress? How is this that we are making sure that our instruction is consistent? And for making ongoing instructional decisions. This is all information, rather than, again, waiting till, you know, the end of the school year and saying, or every year when, you know, that 1 year comes around, it's like, let's look at the IEP, how are we doing? You know, when you think about that over a 15-year period of time, which is typically our sons and daughters' educational career, so that you would only be meeting for 15 times to make a lifetime of decisions is not enough. You need to be meeting with them more often. So once the IEP is developed, it's time to establish user-friendly data collection systems. You know, some data collection systems are burdensome and detract from the instructional momentum of the day. And what you can do is, I mean, there again is developing a rubric. There are rubrics that you can actually have on your computer. There is software that can help create data collection systems. The most important thing is how are we collecting the data and for what reason? You know, I've been in situations where, you know, the only data that has been collected is when the student was doing something wrong. And what we want to do is be able to collect when and how this person is making progress. Like I said, oftentimes, a student who's on an IEP are looked under with more scrutiny than a neurotypical child. And so we need to, you know, first off, I always say, is this something that a neurotypical child would typically do? Any other students in your class doing the same thing? then there's a model also going on, and there is something that's chronologically going on, which could be hormones. Or
Monica?
Yes.
Do you want us to hold our questions till the end, or do you want to answer a question in the chat?
Oh, we can answer.
It was a direct message.
Oh,
Are there any recommendations to address a situation in which a SPED case manager teacher is new and they're new to in-person learning? They use triggering, shaming, and guilting language. They don't communicate to paras or parents. The paras are using threatening language, and the kids are experiencing extremely elevated anxiety levels, so not able to consistently go to their gen ed classes, and retreating to the learning strategies room or nurse's room and repeatedly getting sick to avoid going to school. The SPED teacher gives a grade for learning strategies and grades down for participation when kids are shutting down due to anxiety. This is a middle school.
yeah. And I would, without knowing a whole lot other than, that situation or scenario, that's unfortunately not an unusual scenario. A teacher who's new, that's no excuse. But if that is the case, I would certainly meet with or ask for the principal and talk with the principal. If also that doesn't work, I would talk with the OSPI ombudsman and provide them with that information so that there can be an investigation, and also ways to help this person, because some schools and they have teacher mentors, and in that case there looks like there needs to be a teacher mentor helping with this person, because shame, blame, and that doesn't do anything. When you have somebody, again, going back to having a person understand, especially if there is a person who has executive function and critical thinking problems, which is one of the, not every person, but it is a typical characteristic of autism, to understand that there is a connection between the shame to what they did and what they should do. That's the point where it needs to be taught. And when you have a person who has a social communication disorder, and this person is socially and communicating a very negative response, she basically is pushing up against the person's access to a free and appropriate public education, because she is basically denying this person's right to their education based on their autism diagnosis, which is a social communication disorder. And so those would be some of my recommendations. The OSPI ombudsman to step in, talk with the principal. If those are things that don't work, then there's also the process of mediation. And then also the next step, there's always a way, if that is, I would go with the least, aggressive point of view, which would be, literally taking them to court. These are the processes that you can go through. That can certainly be helpful, and Malia put those in the chat box. That would hopefully be a point.
Yeah, going to court should be the last resort, because you pay and then you're not getting a free an appropriate education anymore because you're paying lawyer fees.
That's right.
And the schools put aside a large budget just for legal fees, so they have lawyers already at the event. So if you can, try to go through those other avenues first.
Yep. And like I said, you can always ask, like we have the Washington PAVE there, an advocacy support, have an advocate come into the classroom, you can have an independent evaluation. You can have, there are a lot of things that can happen, and those can be recommended to you, and those steps to be made, because that's an awful scenario. That's an awful scenario for any student, but you put somebody who has a disability that has the unfortunate outcome of many committing suicide because of depression, that is absolutely one. In any case, it's absolutely inappropriate. So, all right. And I'm sorry that you're having to go through that situation, that scenario. That's, like I said, that's inappropriate. All right. So let's, moving on. So the IEP is critical because it steers the educational program for any given student. And back to, again, the subject of, you know, a teacher doing what they are doing. We need to make sure that the instruction and the supports that this person needs to be successful in general education, in that case, an IEP meeting maybe needed to be reconvened again, and we are talking about explicit instructional supports that would be by the teacher understanding what the social component or the social perspective from a student's for a student with autism and their social perspective and how it's compromised and how they need more support to understand those, that they are not just getting it through osmosis by following directions and knowing socially what everybody else is doing. It needs to be and have an explicit and implicit instruction. The IEP will be successful when you have all voices respected. And I think I mentioned that before, although having an IEP sent ahead of time is important, but having input into the development of the IEP through a person-centered plan would be the best scenario. Is when the case conference meeting follows the recommendation provided, school staff and families increase the likelihood of success for the student and ensure that the student's time is well spent. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to IEP meetings over and over again, and we get to the point of wordsmithing rather than, all right, how is this going to happen? Let's get into the process and the procedures and how we're going to collect data and when we're going to reconvene. It can get really thick in the weeds, and we want to rise above and be able to say what's going to be in the best we're just one in my head, in the best interest of the student, rather than we want to make sure all of our I's are crossed, all our I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And that's where, again, looking at person-centered planning is just so important. So, you know, I think about person-centered plan is, you know, it is, you know, what is self-determination? You know, it is looking at person-centered, how I'm going to move forward. It's self-directed. I am part of this process and I'm moving forward. It's supported decision-making. I'm part of the process and I'm moving forward. Well, what happens is, here's a clue, that a person who has difficulties with social communication, critical thinking, and executive function, all of this needs to be brought up during this person-centered process and be able to provide support so this person can duly make academic achievement. So why are these important points to know, and what are the implications of supports for a person with autism? And I'm going to be talking about, you know, abilities, skills, interests, personal styles, families, values, goals, and then ultimately career development. Because we're looking at, as I'm referring to autism, I know that there are some folks that have people with challenges across the spectrum and gifts across the spectrum. And that although a person who is verbal oftentimes can be looked at as in the social culture as being somebody who has more intelligence than, say, a person who is nonverbal, which is completely not the case. It is, how do we look at that whole person and what does that whole person need to be successful? And to not make assumptions based on what a person's able to communicate or not communicate. Person-centered planning is, is that process of a way of helping someone to plan their life and support. And it's focused on really these key features, which is the person with autism is literally at the center of all what is being talked about. That person can invite and should invite anybody that they want, their families, their friends. And then obviously there's their teachers, it may be a mentor, a school psychologist, or anybody that is participating. Matter of fact, I had a gentleman that I facilitated person-centered plan, and the family had great ties with their community and had a lot of community support. And so they made sure that they invited literally, it was a coffee shop owner, because they went in for his hot cocoa almost every day. And then there's their church chaplain or reverend came and participated, as well as some of the kids that were in his youth group. So it's not just about the academic achievement, it's about seeing the person as a whole person. The plans show what is important to a person now and what is going to be important to them in the future. And again, not to get into a lot of the details, because we just don't have time this afternoon, but I certainly have more trainings that we're going to be getting into, is that looking at where a person wants to be in the future. This one young man, that he was just having a lot of difficulty even thinking about what the future would be. He couldn't even imagine what the future would be. And that's somebody who has executive function difficulties, meaning I can't see in the future and I can't work backwards from that. I can't see anything past right here and now. And so just through, finding and saying, that's fine. What we're going to look at is who you are. What do you like? What are your skills and interests? By the time we were done, we started writing down things that were suggestions from the group. And he was, although he got a little shy because people were really kind of singing his praise, and he feels very uncomfortable with that, and hit his head in his mom's shoulder, that at the end I said, so I'll say his name is Kyle. Kyle, this is what we all thought, that, just based on what we have heard and what, everybody has inputted, what do you think about these recommendations? And he went up and marked out of, a dozen or more, 3 that he would find that he felt were interesting, that he would like to do more discovery. He'd like to learn more. And that was Mom. You could have just pushed Mom over with a feather. She's like, this is the first time he's ever thought of anything other than, I just have to go to school and there's no meaning to this. He actually put that there's a process and an understanding of what school is. And that was through this person-centered plan process that really helped him get to that point. Why the tried and true, tool coming back. And why I say this is because the person-centered plan process and procedure was started back in the early 90s by a couple, their name John and Connie O'Brien, who are still in the disability realm, and that they have worked hard to make sure that person-centered planning or the person-centered process, although some places are a lot more watered down than the actual concept when it was first delivered. But that being said, it's something that's been around for obviously many years. And so it has now evolved over 30 years to come back into the forefront. It's here. It's identified as services that must be person-centered. It provides individual supports. It provides and promotes communication, choice, and autonomy. And instead of people making decisions for another people based on a certain disability, we are looking at the person and promoting their communication, their choice, and their ability to participate in their IEP, to go figure, help them, achieve what they will do when they exit school. Person-centered planning is ideal for autism. It's based on the individual, through, it was spelled wrong. Yeah, I put though, through planning tools often needed to be adapted. Sometimes terminology needs to be modified and understood by the person with autism. And that, for instance, being said, for a person that I've done facilitation with, I might have somebody who has autism, who was blind. And so writing things up on a whiteboard seems a little disrespectful. So we made sure that that was something that made sure that we talked about it, and that he had, we had a text to speech that he could, when I wrote it on the whiteboard, it would actually show that he could hear it immediately. He was deaf. I was like, why is this not working right? So he was deaf, that we did speech to text. He was able to read it. And then obviously somebody who was blind. I think of this gentleman, and it's an interesting scenario that he had exited school with a graduation diploma, and went to Washington State University here in Vancouver, and was going to be graduating with a degree, bachelor's in science in computer science, and he's blind. And so people say, no, let's say, I'm sorry, wait again. He wants to write, software, and how he does it is through listening. And so by doing a person-centered plan for him, everything that he does, including codes, is he listens to codes. This is an incredible skill. And so for him to hear what we're saying, but also craft it in a way that visually people can also conceptualize it, was really important. It was a valuable way of meeting everyone's needs. But that's the important piece, is how do we meet the needs of the person who the person-centered plan is about. And like I said, it's a very critical piece in really identifying and helping the person know where they're going to be going and how we're going to get there. The principles of inclusion are incorporated to ensure that the person is not isolated from society. And that, again, and unfortunately, the scenario with the individual that was just talked about with a teacher who, I don't want to make any sweeping judgments or on this person, but there have been situations where the teacher felt that that was the only way that they could get that student out of their classroom. And they were using, a negative behavior to get their needs met, rather than how do I help be a better teacher and include this person, and what tools do I need? So again, incorporating information to make sure that people are not isolated in society. And many folks that that are on the autism spectrum, just because of the dyad of impairment, the first pillar is social communication, difficulties. They tend to self-isolate. They tend to put themselves not within the social complexities of and nuances in society. It's hard. It's hard when this doesn't come naturally. It's just constantly trying to work on it. Another instance that I can tell you, I'm working with a gentleman, a young man, although he doesn't have autism, he has cerebral palsy, and he uses a augmentative communication device, and he has no control over his arms, and he does have some control over his head, to the point where they do have it in a cradle, so he doesn't move it around with a lot of his muscle spasticity. But he uses an eye gaze visual augmentative communication device. So he has some words and phrases that he can just gaze at and that it will automatically say, what he's asking. One of them is that he comes into the house and he just he makes an eye gaze to his augmented communication device, which I can't remember which one it is, but at any rate, it says, Alexa, turn on the lights. And it turns on the lights for him. And then it's Alexa, turn the channel to ESPN. He loves to watch sports. So for this person to be part of his community, it is that he and people need to have a clear understanding of how he's able to communicate. But for him, it's hard. It's really hard that he has to really focus on what he's going to be wanting to say by using his eye gaze. And like I said, for people with autism, it is hard. It's very hard to socially jump from one cultural thought process to another experience and all the subtle nuances that we as social beings are accustomed to and just rotate through without even a second thought. We need to reaffirm that supports need to be proactive instead of the medical model of where a person may be passively or involved with supports that really talk about their impairment rather than how can they be included rather than excluded from their community. The person-centered plan process is more of a social model where a person with a disability or an individual is not framed by their disability. Like I said, the medical model really is based on what a person isn't able to do. So when you go into a doctor's office and the doctor said, so what brings you here today? You're not going to start off with, I really am, I'm a fantastic artist, because I mean, we're not going to get into the strengths and interests. We want to get to the point. What's wrong? How can I help you? How can we, provide you an intervention or some sort of pharmacological intervention so that we can help you have a better life, versus the social model where it is that people are not looked at as their disability. Rather, the barrier isn't their disability. The barrier is access to what everybody else has access to. Similar to what universal design and universal design for learning is all about is, say again, not that I'm going to throw this teacher under the bus that is just being very negative towards her students, is to say the social model is the barrier to that classroom success isn't the person with the disability. It's the teacher who needs more training and support to help increase accessibility to that instruction and to that classroom. That's what really, in a nutshell, what social model is. And so in practice and in practical terms, person-centered plans involves careful planning for an individual, taking into consideration their strengths, their preferences, areas of difficulty, perhaps some of the barriers, and related support strategies, systems at each stage of their educational and transitional life, so that we aren't reinventing the wheel, especially when students exit from elementary into middle school. All of a sudden it's like, oh, we're going to do a whole new instructional priorities. And it's like, wait a minute, this has worked. This needs to be person-centered. We need to make sure that we don't have the person with a disability who constantly has to adapt to every new teacher and every new situation. We need to have this person provided with their supports that they need to be successful. It's access to service. It's access based on their disability. It's just kind of plain as that. This is a tool that, although it's blurry, I still wanted to show you. It's the intervention called Ziggurat. And these are some of the autism implications of supports and services. The individuals that have done this is Ruth Aspey, and I can't remember her husband's name. And Malia, could you look up just through autism Ziggurat, Ruth Aspey, and you will see, if you could put that link in the chat, that would be awesome. I would so much appreciate it. I should have put that on this citing on this page, but I didn't. So at any rate, what it does, it goes into kind of a scaffold of what are the interventions that we need
Oh.
to.
Sorry. Her name is Aspie.
Aspie, Ruth Aspie,
Yeah,
A-S-P-Y.
that's
I
just
know.
funny.
Isn't that funny? I know. It was like, well, she was, it was predetermined what she was going to be doing in her life. And so what it starts with is the implications of services and support start with looking at the sensory and the biological needs of an individual. The environment, are we meeting the needs of that person's sensory? The environment in particular, the people, the culture, people around them, all the sensory and biological needs, are they being met? We've got the reinforcements. What's motivating for this individual? And then we talk about the structure and the needs of it, the needs for the structure and instruction, I should say, and what they need, a person needs to be able to help them achieve academic success. And then we have the task demand, and then we have basically skills to teach. And this is basically a very in-depth way of looking at that. They've also put together is not only what I just referred to is the ziggurat is their scaffold of interventions, but also the process of, you know, evidence-based strategies to look at what we need for instruction for students with autism. There are specific ways that we provide instruction. I can also say that universal design for learning as a way of providing information is very beneficial for students with autism, because part of the delivery is through visual information, is through different modalities of instruction rather than just a one size fits all. And then underlying characteristics, I'll go through that really quickly, classic versus high functioning. And although those are two very antiquated mindsets, they haven't yet changed that. Antecedent-based interventions, and then they have, the individual strengths and skills inventory, the antecedent-based interventions, assessments that are really based on the characteristics of autism. I'll talk about a comprehensive autism planning system, and then implications to supports and instruction. And, you know, as we get through this, you know, like I said, this is a lot of information in a very short period of time. So I usually say for folks, you know, buckle up, because you're in for a ride. What I'll hope that you will do for yourself is to just write out certain things that you really want to do some research on, to be and not become overwhelmed and say, I can't do any of this. This as a compilation of many years, over 20 years that I've been doing this, that, you know, that I'm able to put something together, have the practice, have the advocacy, and have the instructional components to this. This didn't happen overnight. So give yourself a little bit of space, and take what you can and continue to learn. So the Center for Disease Control, CDC, and the National Institute of Mental Health says that psychosocial and behavioral interventions are key parts of comprehensive support programs for people with autism. And some of the most common interventions are, as I referred to before, applied behavior analysis through the process of discrete trial training, early intensive behavioral interventions, incidental teaching, pivotal response training. There's also verbal behavior interventions, developmental, individual differences, relationship-based interventions, also referred to as DIR, and also floor time. And then there is relationship development intervention, RDI, and support and education of autistic and communication-related handicapped children, which is referred to as TEACH, out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and antecedent-based interventions. I'm going to touch on some of these that I feel more proficient in, and while there will be others that I would highly suggest you do some research on. The National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders recognizes that first, that they are a multi-universal university center to promote, designed to promote the use of evidence-based practices for children and adolescents with the autism spectrum disorder. Ruth Aspey and Barry Grossman, that I remember his name now, they developed, as I refer to as the UCC, the underlying characteristic checklist. And that's what I'm going to be going through here in just a few minutes as we get through these next probably 20 or 30 minutes of this training, is looking at really what are some of the underlying characteristics, how a person displays the symptom, and then identify what is the implications of support. This isn't used for diagnosis, but what it does is help identify the characteristics across several domains that is very helpful in understanding how can we put in instructional supports for students on this autism spectrum. And what is usually asked is that the ICC, or not the ICC, the UCC, underlying characteristic checklist, is completed by both the parent and the staff. If the student is able to do it, I would certainly have them do it as well. The completion of the UCC is an intervention in itself. It increases awareness of the characteristics and impacts on the individual, leads to decreased frustration on the whole part of the team. When you can see, as you go through the UCC, it has categorically identified, and you'll see here as I go through that what I'm talking about. So we're looking at the UCC, the symptoms, and then the implications and supports. So the symptoms will be, as you see on my left, probably your left side as well, where it says symptoms. Those will be what I have obtained from the underlying characteristic checklist. So the symptoms, which would be the UCC, is first, a problem understanding verbal commands, has a limited topics of conversation, does not communicate one's own needs, has delayed processing, understanding based on context, that they're very concrete literal thinkers, or may ask a lot of questions. And so as a person is going through this process, they will start identifying what does this mean? And the symptoms under this is, the communication and language problems. These are some of the issues related to this person's disability. And when you think about this teacher, that if a person who has communication and language problems, that they have problem not understanding verbal commands, that they might not understand context based on verbal information, they may ask a lot of questions. Then what the teacher might need to know is the implications and support is this person learns best through visual structure and routines. They need to learn the power and the function of communication. Just because a person has language does not mean that they are a communicator. Communication is a functional way of exchanging information through reciprocity, one communicator with another. And then teaching strategies of verbal and imitation, and I would say even intimidation, are not effective. We have to understand what is part of the symptoms, how do we help this person learn, and those then become skills that we can actually identify identify IEP goals and objectives based on really what this UCC is identifying. Again, the symptoms, when we look at judgment and social relating, really that the UCC have identified is poor eye contact, difficulty modulating behaviors to settings, like the child going from the classroom or out into the recess, and then from recess back into the classroom, and they still had the loud talk. It's just like, oh, they didn't modulate their behavior because they didn't understand that there are different rules to different areas, because that really goes back to their social communication diet of impairment, that they need that instruction instead of just saying, Tommy, you're being too loud, you need to quiet down. all that is telling him is what not to do. It does not say, Tommy, we're inside. Show me how we need to talk. And it could be that he has a list of the social rules or social behaviors when he's in a classroom. A person may have a peculiar effect and it's not consistent with the contact with a person. And how I can describe that is, say a person is, and I think of myself from my, there have been instances, let me just preface this, my son does not like it when mom is upset. It is very, very difficult for him. So if I am upset and for whatever reason I might be crying, he will come up to me and he looks at me, but then he'll ask me for something that is, he just wants my attention. He doesn't see, I mean, that is kind of the perspective from somebody else's point of view. He doesn't see that he doesn't like what I look like and I'm feeling. He doesn't understand why, and he wants me to just stop it. You might have the other peculiar effect. And of course they show it on TV. I don't know how many times, I can't remember the doctor show where it shows the surgeon young man who supposedly has autism, that he has a very engaging or animated facial features. And those can be considered peculiar because they don't match what other people might say or be able to express, because we take so much information from what we express on our face. Might have lack of response to emotions. It doesn't mean that a person with autism doesn't have emotions, but they may not see that another person is expressing themselves that emotion and they don't recognize it. We actually have to say, I'm upset, I need some time. So if you can excuse me for a moment. Difficulty taking another person's perspective. Again, that goes back to that perspective, from somebody else's point of view. Let's just take, for instance, why is that teacher, and I'm sorry to be, belaboring this issue, that why is this teacher so mean? And taking the other person's perspective, we have to find out this teacher is mean because she is fearful of people with disabilities. That is totally projecting. I have no idea, but it is really helping that person understand from another person's point of view. Why are they acting this way? And what does that mean? Somebody, judgment and relating is problems with limitation or boundaries, stepping over the boundaries, being not understanding that, the coins on somebody's desk belong to that person, or that another young man that I worked with, I'm not laughing, I'm just, again, that's kind of a nervous laugh, is when he was in school, he had a crush on a young lady, and because of his peculiar affect and because he didn't understand the social judgment, the whole social cultural thing, he followed this lady and really kind of stared at her to the point where she felt uncomfortable and actually had a restraining order brought against him. He didn't know that there are social ways to be able to do it, because there are other young men doing the same thing, but they made themselves inconspicuous. While, let's say his name is Jason didn't. Jason was there, and she felt uncomfortable. Limited social interactions. There's some folks that might just be, the social communication part of their disability is, that maybe having limited amount of people, maybe even only one person that they interact with, rather than, we have folks that, if you have high school kids or even young adults, they love doing things together. They love doing things, as a group, whereas a person with autism may not. So what are the implications of support? Is what we do know is a person with autism doesn't learn from watching other people. They don't understand the context or the concepts that are happening. They might engage in things that they don't understand. I can tell you that oftentimes we have people who model, oh, we're going to do this. This is how you do it. This is how you do it. or by even saying, you know, which is what we do socially. One of the social things that we do as if we're in a group, you walk into a room, the first thing you do is you size it up and you think, gosh, why aren't they sitting at these tables? They're all standing up near the wall. You know, what's that about? That we kind of go through that. It's like, well, I'm not going to go sit at the table until other people start sitting on the table. We kind of go through this whole process, that the person with autism, they're going to come walking in the door and sit in the front, you know, probably at the front table. Matter of fact, I've had people that I have known, and I've been a presenter at a conference, and they see me and they will walk right up, and I am standing at a podium talking. Hi, Monica, I need to tell you something. It's like, and I remember this gentleman, it's like, Donald, yes, I'm talking right now. Oh, and just didn't even notice or even had any vague idea that I was actually presenting, and that him walking up was actually, you know, one of those limitations, one of those boundaries that he didn't recognize. But we can provide social narratives and that, you know, or social stories that are descriptive, perspective, and informative that help the person, are provided with directions. If you haven't looked at social stories or social narratives, it is a prescriptive way that was developed by a speech and language pathologist by the name of Carol Gray, who is just was phenomenal in helping people with autism and other social, emotional, or social judgment, learn the perspective from somebody else's point of view. It really is. And we need to infuse that into real life implementation of the strategies, and not just teach it in isolation and think the person's going to get it. You know, I use social stories with my son all the time. One of the things that is a big concern is that he has a really significant auditory sensitivity when his anxiety is up. His ability to handle large and loud noises, he gets into a fight, flight or freeze. And so every time we go into a restaurant, I do a social story that says, you know, why we're there, and why everybody else is there, that they're hungry, that they all want to eat. Even people when they're sick need to eat. Even when they cough and sneeze, they need to eat. We're all going to eat our dinner, and when we eat our dinner, we can go home and we can have a full stomach. And then the direction would be that when Michael follows the rules and goes to the car, or Michael can go to the car, or he can wait for mom, and then he will be, you know, the affirmation is actually another part of this. In some cases, and for Michael's case, that makes a lot of difference to him, is mom will be happy, everyone will be happy when Michael follows the rules. Because when somebody coughs or sneezes, he gets into a fight or flight. And I would say, well, it is pretty much a 50-50. 50-50. He's going to be either into a fight or flight. He doesn't freeze. He's either going to fight, become aggressive, or he's going to flight, which is he's going to run out the door. So I want to help him. If you become scared and it hurts your ears, I want you to go to the car. So I'm telling him, I'm giving him the description, I'm giving him information, and I'm giving him a directive. And that's what social stories are all about. So people who have different, hold on a second, Mike. Differences in their cognitive thinking, their cognition or ability to make good decisions, basically, is the symptoms is difficulty with meaning and abstract thinking. So when you have a teacher that says, you know, I really would like you to think about, you know, writing a poem about your experience walking through a forest. That becomes abstract thinking for some students. That is a very difficult task. Judgment, you know, just understanding that, is this a good idea or not? Like, I'm going to follow what these other kids are doing because it looks like it's fun, but I don't have the judgment to say whether this is a good idea or not. The ability to integrate ideas, to be able to say that, you know, For instance, just, I'm trying to think, for instance, with that, integrating ideas like the work I'm doing with universal design for learning is I'm constantly looking at, oh, how can I integrate this into the work that I'm doing with adults in the community? That's integrating an idea. For oftentimes a person with autism, they are very literal, black and white, and that doesn't always bridge that generality. Very concrete, literal thinkers, sometimes very slow to process, especially with sensory bombardment that they might be experiencing. They have slow to process information, may only focus on details, may have a slow pace, may not be able to tell relevant from irrelevant information, may have trouble with choices because, choices can be difficult for some. So you want to, really pare down where the choices come from. And that is a whole other thing where I've had people say, well, I gave them a choice, but they wouldn't make a choice. And I said, well, there is a difference between asking a person a question and a choice. So a choice, an example of that would be the cafeteria lady saying, what would you like for lunch? That's a question. The choice is, we have today turkey sandwiches, macaroni and cheese, and a salad. That's a choice. So without having something to rely on to make a choice can be very difficult for that person who experiences these symptoms. Sometimes can't tell the difference between dirty and clean. If it's clothes, it's clothes. I wear it. Can be very indecisive. Excuse me. So the implications of support really is extreme problem with generalization that we need to teach in new situations with new people and new materials. We need to utilize strategies to minimize problems with judgment, give extra processing time, and highlight important information. And I have trainings that are really specific on universal design for learning and the implications of support and what those might be. And unfortunately, we just don't have the time for that today. So it may have problems with organizing and sequencing, which kind of all goes back to, again, the executive function or critical thinking. Like, for instance, doesn't know where to start or know what's next or when to finish. That we need to emphasize visual clarity and systematic or routine ways of doing things. A person may have uneven scattered patterns of development. So you might have one person who's really good at numbers, rote memories, and music. A couple of young men that I know that are incredibly talented with piano playing, and yet they don't know the sequence of getting themselves dressed. So what is the difference between executive function and a person's cognitive ability or intellect are completely two different things. So we can't make that assumption or that connection. And then problems with language and abstract reasoning. And then some individuals can read, but we can't make the assumption that the person has comprehension. We have to figure out they're able to read words, they have word recognition, but they may not have the comprehension. So the implications to support could be we all need to make sure there's an individual approach, that we assess a full range of skills and strategies, and we can't assume skills based in one area over another, just as the example that I gave you. Restricted repertoire behaviors and ritualistic behaviors. So it can be easily upset with change in environments, with holidays, as we're going through now, with new foods, new clothes, moving, change of staff, change of environments, a lot of things. When a person has that restrictive repertoire behaviors, that these are the symptoms that are related to it. That free time can be very difficult because it's unstructured. A person who has that focus on sameness and sometimes repetitive restrictive repertoire behaviors, that free time is difficult, and sometimes they might engage in the same thing over and over again because they don't have executive function to think of, you know, I want to try something else. They do something to fill their time. And what we need to do is help them find a way to give them opportunity or choices in their free time. A person who is at restrictive repertoire behaviors memorizes the world. They like things in a certain way, and they can be very upset and confused when things change. Some people with autism have elaborate rituals because they have that restrictive repertoire behaviors, and the same for routine and ritualistic behaviors. And the implications of supports would be that work is easier than leisure, downtime and breaks, classroom time, all that sometimes can be much a task or something that they're, you know, whether it's sometimes it's just what the point right now that we have a lot of kids that can get really involved with playing games on the computer because it is very structured and it is very easy for them to do that. Doing something else actually pushes and challenges their abilities, and although they need it to help them be able to, you know, really succeed in life, and rather than just not sitting in mom and dad's basement for the rest of the life playing games. That being said, people need predictability, they need routines. And within that, we can put in routines that have, it's not just, these are all the things that you need to do today. How do we infuse opportunities that people know that I get to have downtime, or I get to have, when do I get to have my computer time? First we do math, then we have computer, then we have, you know, our reading of one chapter. Then we might do math problems, and then you're going to have another opportunity for computer. That we embed motivational opportunities so a person can complete a task or an activity so that they can get to something that's motivating and it's happy and exciting to do. I can tell you that's no different for you or I. If there is something that I'm going to be doing that is challenging, I think to myself, I've got to get this done. I've got to get this done. And inevitably, I will reward myself, whether it's with, you know, a cup of coffee or taking my dog for a walk or doing something. It's like I constantly am providing myself with motivational experiences throughout my day, which is no different than what we need to do for people that experience autism. Sensory perception problems. Again, another one of those big areas is the symptoms could be like a person who licks and smells things, inconsistent response to different sounds. Like for my son, if he's having a bad day or if we're in a social anxiety situation, his ability to process auditory input is very, very difficult and can be put him into a fight or flight. People can be very distracted, can be over or under reacted to different sensory input. A person can stare at lights, could have very low or no pain response when they're hurt or in pain. So the implications of supports, and this I do actually a whole training just on sensory and perception problems. So this is just not even a snapshot, but it gives you something to think about. But implications of support is we want to minimize distraction, highlight important elements. And sometimes if we need to embed a sensory diet throughout a person's day. And what does that mean? If you have a person who likes deep pressure, or like for me, I mean, I would say I need myself is to do something with gross motor, large muscles. I don't have autism, but I have a need to be able to go out and walk because that helps me clear my head. And so I infuse taking my dog for a walk. And actually, as you can hear her barking, she needs to go for a walk. That it just helps us throughout our day. And that can be, you know, some people, it's like they listen to music while they're doing something, you know, to help them reduce the distractions so that they can attend to what they need to do. Or you might have a person who I need to have indirect light so that that fluorescent light isn't making me nauseous or sick. So infusing and understanding those things are all part and parcel to the symptoms and the interventions that we need to support individuals with autism with. So moving from assessment, putting these pieces together and moving from assessment to intervention design and instructional design is, I talked about the assessment tools, talked about the comprehensive intervention plan, and then the implementation. How do we make sure that these items that we've been talking about, that we have a way of intervention and implementing them, and that we evaluate the outcomes through data. That cumulative effect, like I said earlier today, is, when people take things out of context, that this behavior came out of absolutely nowhere. One thing that I want people to understand is that, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. And what seems to be like a behavior that comes out of the blue is really an overexposure to continual stressful situations that they've held it together, that all of a sudden it seems like it's out of the blue, but this person has held it together after 3 or 4 attempts. And it was just like, it's the straw that breaks the camel back. And so looking at, again, the whole picture for each of our students is going to be so imperative, because we just can't take something at face value. There are implications that are embedded throughout everybody's, each person's, their DNA, how they're made up. We need to talk about de-escalation strategies. How do you know when the learner is stressed? What are stressful events to the learner? Understand the learner's de-escalation supports. We need to infuse supports throughout that person's day, like a sensory diet or like other supports to help that person be able to regulate difficult situations. Give more supports when the learner is having a stressful day. When a student's having a difficult day and is not able to hand in their paperwork, they're not able to attend to the classroom, the last thing you want to do is say, go to the principal's office. You might want to say, get down there on Timmy's level and say, hey, Timmy, you're having a bad day. What can I do to help you today? What do you need? So, or just being able to recognize, it looks like you're having a bad day. Do you need some sensory supports? I have some choices for you. It's a respectful way of again, not demeaning a person when they're having a stressful day, but providing them supports, because they don't have oftentimes a way to self-modulate, and they need that help and support and security. And I'm sure people have seen the iceberg, the ABC iceberg analogy is communication. Behavior is communication, or communication is a form, or behavior is communication, or behavior is a form of communication. It incorporates the relationship between the characteristics of autism that I've just gone through and really the behavior and how they manifest. And this is just kind of looking at the analogy is, it's a way of describing the critical aspects of an object or a circumstance that aren't fully apparent to the observer. We know that there are interventions based on the iceberg and concepts that are designed to address underlying deficits or the underlying characteristics that I've gone through, and that teach, as I'll go into, applies this analogy to aid in the understanding of behaviors associated with an autism spectrum disorder. So, and again, not to go through a lot of this in detail, because I have to run through here. I can't remember how many pages I had. This is terrible. I only have just a few minutes. Oh golly, I got a lot of stuff to go through. I didn't even put page numbers. You can see how organized I was today. So when we look at the model applied to social isolation, the antecedents, what we have, the antecedents behavior consequences, which I have on the top. What that can be is, what does that look like? The symptoms could be is one, the antecedent, they're at recess, it's low structured, it's after lunch. Two, that the student is wandering the perimeter of the school, that they're flopping their hands and looking at bugs and talking to themselves. And then the other is that they might be isolated from peers. opportunities to gauge in stereotypic behaviors. And the underlying concepts or underlying characteristics is that, they have abnormal sensitivity to sound and visual stimuli. I'm not going to go through all this because we just don't have the time, but it really starts putting into play, again, what I had identified as what does it look like? And this is related to the specific characteristic of the person with autism, and this is applied to social isolation. And this might be related to, a meltdown. You have the antecedent is the student is given a written task. The meltdown is the student hits the teacher, yells, cries, puts head on the table. And then the consequence is, the unfortunate reality is that they miss 5 minutes of recess when they actually needed that recess. Does assignment in a special education classroom with fewer students. So how do we look at that, and how do we then not constantly reprimand a student for something that they're not able to do related to their own social emotional regulation? It is applied to, the model of, applying it to meltdowns. With all of this, I go into this next piece, which is another tool, which is called CAPS, which is the Comprehensive Autism Planning System that was developed by Brenda Smith-Miles, and ensures the individual's needs are met throughout, I say employment, but the whole student's school environment. It recognizes the complex needs of an individual with autism. It's individualized, it's systematic, yet flexible. It facilitates transition from one grade to the next and facilitates professional development. And this is, when I talked about data of not only saying, what is a student, what are they doing that's great? What are some of the barriers to preventing them from getting their assignment done? And what is the teacher or the instructor, and how are they meeting the needs of the person's disability that we're talking about with an autism spectrum disorder? So it really targets the time and the activity. What are the structure and modification the student needs to be successful in that activity? What's reinforcing, motivating? What are the sensory strategies needed? What are the communication social skills? How is data collection? And how does this plan get generalized into other classrooms? Because why are we reinventing the wheel when we can have, if we have it in one place, we can certainly generalize it into another. So putting together the ziggurat and the CAPS, it begins with the completion of the underlying characteristic checklist and the individual skills, the ISSI, and information attained in incorporating into the CAPS, which is what I just identified. How do you take that information and put it into a very concise way, almost like a recipe? When this person goes into math class, the structure modification that they need is visual representation, and maybe even a breakdown that for the, within the first 15 minutes of class, you do these math problems. The last part of class, you do these this problems. The reinforcement is that you will have, you're able to do your own math problems that you like to do, which is reinforcing what are the sensory strategies that they are sitting, in a certain location of the classroom so that they are not distracted. What are the communication and the social skills? It could be that we're using visual representation, and the social skills that we're using is that we can have, this person be able to interact with their peers. And then we have data collection. And so beginning with all of this, like I said, is taking that information and putting it together and utilizing it in a CAP, the Comprehensive Autism Planning System, so that we literally have a prescriptive way for when that student leaves your home, your classroom with a special ed teacher into a general education. There's literally an outline. This is how you do it. Because I can tell you how many students are on an IEP that don't have something prescriptive. What is typically required of that student when they come into the classroom is compliance. And that often leads to a lot of problems. So I am right at 3:00. I do have more information that I'm just gonna skate through here for the next minute. So generalization, crossing all environments, using the CAPS and the UCC, using teach visual supports and other ideas that are through Chapel Hill of North Carolina, antecedent-based interventions, enriching the environment so the person with autism can have access to sensory stimuli that serves at the same function as an interfering behavior. And I can go on. And that you are, as a parent, are the lifelong case manager. You will be there for that person throughout their life. And it's something that you need always to have support and strategies around you, people that have gone the journey. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy New Year's. And remember that this is a journey. It's not the journey, but weathering the journey. It is not always the destination, but it really is. This is a journey. This is a journey that will continue throughout this person's life. So I hope you find moments of joy and celebration through this generation, through this journey, because that's what's going to get you through it. So I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Monica. Does anyone have any questions? It's 3:00. So I don't know if we have time for questions, but there's an email that's going out after this. And if you do have questions, you can ask them in the email. So, and you'll have her email address there.
Absolutely.
And I'll send out the link to the YouTube video shortly. Well, not too shortly. It takes a little bit.
Right. Yes. Got to download it, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.